Well, this screen lecture is going to be about the plants. The plant kingdom, I could talk for days and days on, but this is just a survey, so we kind of want to take a look at what kind of plants are out there and how do we classify them. So the previous groups we looked at, viruses, which are not even alive, are classified by what they infect, and then the prokaryotes are classified by like what kind of cell membrane chemistry they have, whether it's ether or ester phospholipids, and then the next group, the protists, are classified as protozoa or algae based on their structures and their DNA. And then we went to the fungi, which are more closely related to the animals. They're classified actually by how they reproduce. And that brings us to the plants here. Plants are classified by how they reproduce also. So there are the major groups of plants that you're familiar with are probably the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, but there are lots of primitive plants on Earth that are kind of obscure, but they were major steps and milestones in the evolution of plant life on Earth. By definition, plants are multicellular and autotrophic, which means that they have more than one cell in their body and they can make their own food. They use chlorophyll for photosynthesis. That's a chemical, it's a pigment that absorbs sunlight. And they use the sunlight that chlorophyll catches to store in carbohydrates. Now, plants evolved from green algae. The Caryophyceans, we think, are their ancestors. And they're classified, the Caryophyceans are classified with the plants. The invasion of land was late in the history of the Earth. The Earth is, we think, at least 4 point something billion years old, and the land was barren and hostile until the last eighth of the time of the history of the Earth. So only over the last 400 million years or so has there been anything on land that we would call plants. The first plants that we're aware of that may have colonized the land were liverworts and hornworts. We don't yet know exactly where they came from. We think they came from Caryophyceans, but we don't know the steps that were involved in evolving them. The liverworts and hornworts gave rise then to mosses, and which then gave rise to the seedless vascular plants, which are the ferns and their relatives. And then the ferns gave rise to the gymnosperms, which are trees you're familiar with. Those are our Christmas trees, pine trees, fir, hemlock, spruce. We build our houses from those trees and we make furniture from those trees. And then the gymnosperms gave rise to the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants, which include everything from orchids and the grasses on your yard or your lawn, all the way to flowering oak trees, make up the flowering plants. So let's take a look. This is a cladogram of the plant kingdom. Here's the original ancestral green algae did produce the Caryophyceans, but it also branched away and produces a line that led to the liverworts and also to the hornworts and then to the mosses. Now, I've never actually found a hornwort, but I have liverworts growing in my yard. They're little leathery plants. You'll see them in just a minute when you scroll down. And they're a little different than mosses. The liverworts look like little leaflets growing right on the ground. Mosses, on the other hand, look like tiny little pine trees standing upright. From some ancient moss ancestor, the lycophytes grew. Lycophytes are club mosses, and at one time the land was theirs. But an ancient lycophyte led also to the ferns and their relatives, and those are the pterophytes. But one of those ancestors also led to the gymnosperms, which are the conifers that grow especially in the mountains on Earth today. But another branch of that line led to the dicots and the monocots, which are the two types of flowering plants that dominate the world today. The monocots are the grasses, the orchids, the lilies, are all in this group. And the dicots include all of the other flowering plants. Most of the trees that grow in Missouri are dicot trees. So hickory trees, oak trees, sweet gum trees, sycamore trees, those are all dicot trees. Okay, so let's take a scroll down here and take a look now. These are liverworts. They grow right on the ground. They're little goofy, wavy, undulating leaflets. Mosses, on the other hand, look like little tiny pine trees that stick up in the air. These plants, they're called the bryophytes. They are very small. You'll miss them completely if you're not looking close. If you were on a hike and you were walking along, you wouldn't even notice they were there unless you stop and take a close peek. They tend to only grow in really damp areas. They are non-vascular, so they have no conductive water conducting cells in their body, so they can only soak water off the ground. Trees can actually conduct water from the ground up into the air. That's because they have conductive tissue. But mosses and liverworts actually soak water like a paper towel. They have no true roots, stems, or leaves. So they're very primitive plants. They certainly have never gotten very tall because of the fact that they don't have vascular tissue. One of the major inventions in the evolution of plant life was the evolution of vascular tissue, uh, cells that could actually conduct water. So something we take for granted is that all plants grow up in the air, but that is only made possible by water pipes. Without water pipes, you are on the ground. So, as a matter of fact, you're not only on the ground, you have to be on wet ground. So, tracheophytes are vascular plants. Most of the plants on Earth that are alive today are tracheophytes. There are three general types of tracheophytes. The seedless vascular plants are the first group, and then there's the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Those are the other two groups. So the seedless vascular plants include most famously, among others, the pteridophytes. That's the ferns and their relatives. They reproduce not with seeds but with spores. And they actually make sperms and eggs on wet, rainy nights. And here in Missouri, that's in the spring. Ferns do have true roots, stems, and leaves, unlike the mosses before them. But oddly, they have underground stems. Their stems do not grow above the ground. There are a few tropical ferns that have above ground stems, but in Missouri here, our ferns have underground stems. And that's why ferns are pretty short. You only see their leaves sticking out of the ground. The stem is in the ground. Their leaves are called fronds, and that's because they're structured pinnately compound, which we'll talk more about later, but it's a bunch of leaflets branching off of a central stem. They do have xylem, which is the famous water pipe to conduct water, and they also have phloem to conduct sap, which is food. So fern, fiddlehead, some people eat these, club mosses, and horsetails are all in this group. None of them make seeds, but they all have conductive tissue. They're fairly short, and they are reproducing using spores, not seeds. Now, then that brings us to the second of the three big vascular plants, which are the gymnosperms. Gymnosperm stands for naked seed plant. Turns out these plants all produce their seeds in cones, and that's a cycad cone right there. When the cone opens, the seeds are naked and they're unprotected and edible, actually. Pine nuts are eaten by people and every other animal that can get a hold of them. Most pine seeds are edible. So the seeds are produced in cones in a naked fashion. They have better vascular tissue than the ferns, so they can grow tall. In fact, the tallest plants in the world are in this group. That is the redwoods, which grow in our own country, Southern California. The oldest trees in the world are in this group. Those are the bristlecone pines. This is a bristlecone pine here. The largest trees in the world are in this group. Those are the sequoias in Sequoia National Forest and Sequoia National Park in Southern California. And I've already mentioned the tallest, the redwoods. These plants usually have needles and not the traditional leaf for photosynthesis. So this is a ginkgo, which is unusual for a gymnosperm. Most gymnosperms do not have leaves like this. They have needles like those there, or you can't see them here, but they're tiny little green wax-coated spines is pretty much what a needle is. So the wood of this group of plants is extremely useful for construction, and that's what we build our houses out of. So I'll move forward now, but the gymnosperms are a major player of plant life on Earth. They're found mostly in the mountains where broadleaf plants cannot grow for long. Oak trees just can't survive at 10,000 foot altitude in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado because it just doesn't stay warm there long enough during the growing season. But pine trees with their needles can photosynthesize throughout the year and stay alive. Now that brings us to the last group of plants, the angiosperms. These are the plants you're familiar with. Orchids, which are on sale now at just about every garden and hardware store, are in this group. In fact, orchids are the largest family of flowering plants. Flowering plants produce seeds and flowers, and the flower provides a protective medium. It's an ovary. The ovary of the flower protects the seeds, so the seeds do not grow naked, but instead grow in a protected, like pulp. You think of it as a giant ovary is essentially what a watermelon is, and the seeds are protected inside that pulp inside the watermelon. So flowering plants have even better vascular tissue than gymnosperms, and that's why they dominate, except in really cold climates. Uh, Pine trees just cannot outcompete uh, flowering broadleaf trees, except where fire or cold is a major problem. So the gymnosperms dominate in the colder climates. The angiosperms dominate in warmer, wetter climates. Uh, Angiosperms have better seed dispersal systems than the gymnosperms. Most pine trees disperse their seeds in the air. Most angiosperms disperse their seeds in multitudes of ways. The purpose of a watermelon is to get you to eat the watermelon, hopefully swallow some seeds. You won't digest the seeds; they'll pass through you, and they'll pass out of you in your feces. And the hope is that you'll poop on the ground somewhere, and then the watermelon will grow from that. But flowering plants, some species produce the burr, which is a seed that sticks to your clothing, and then you carry those seeds away. Deer do that in my yard, and I have all kinds of unusual seeds of weeds that grow in the middle of my lawn because deer drop the seeds off of their fur onto my lawn. Deer also carry seeds in their feces. They drop those on my lawn. Some flowering plants, like ash trees, do disperse their seeds in the wind. Dandelions disperse their seeds in the wind. They're flowering plants. They have just the gamut. There are even a few, like coconuts, disperse their seeds by floating them in the ocean. There are two broad types of angiosperms. There are the dicots and the monocots. Dicots are easily distinguished from the monocots in that dicots have branching leaf veins in their leaves. Sunflowers, coneflowers, daisies, most broadleaf trees are in this group. So oak, hickory, sweet gum, ash are in this group. Common weeds growing along the roadsides and in lawns are almost always in this group. In fact, weed killers often kill dicots but not monocots, and that's why your lawn doesn't die when you spray weed killer on it. You're killing dicot weeds but not the monocot grasses. Dicots got their name because they have two halves in their seeds. Like when you crack a peanut open, the two sides of the peanut fall apart from each other, showing that the peanut was a dicot. It had branched veins in its leaves, and its flower parts are in 4s or 5s, and it has all the other characteristics of dicots. The dicot species on Earth do outnumber the monocots, but the largest family of flowering plants is the orchids, which grow mostly in tropical areas. Missouri only has about 6 species of orchid that grow throughout the state, but in the tropics there's about 20,000 species and counting. Monocots have parallel leaf veins, so like the grass is a monocot, which grows on your lawn. All the veins in the leaves run tip to tip. Monocots have only one seed leaf in their seed, so when you're eating a corn kernel, when you crack the corn kernel open, there's only one pulp in there. Unlike the peanut, which has 2, there's just one pulp inside. That's what monocot means, only one seed leaf, which is that pulp on the inside. Grasses, orchids, and lilies are in this group, and this group does encompass the major crop plants of the world. Corn, wheat, and rice are all grasses, and they produce most of the food that feeds human beings. So that concludes the plant kingdom, and we'll move on in just a moment to the animal kingdom.